Hi, everyone. Hey, really nice to see you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our symposium on diversity and inclusion here at the Trippenhuis. My name is Eddie Brummerman. I'm a board member at the Young Academy, which is part of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Art and Sciences, or the KNAW. And I think we are all here today because we are all concerned about fairness. We all want to create environments in which other people, our students and our colleagues, can flourish, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their socioeconomic status or race or ethnicity. But despite all these good intentions, we see, not only in Dutch academia, but also outside, is that many of these inequalities tend to persist. So how can we improve diversity and inclusion? And that's the question that we want to address in today's symposium. And we want to do so not by looking at all the policies that we already have in place in the Netherlands, but by really asking, so what are the barriers that explain why these inequalities persist, and what are new ways of thinking about how we can reduce or remove some of those barriers. And we do so by combining insights from arts as well as science, because art as well as science rely on curiosity and creativity and courage to challenge the status quo. But also we are very dependent on, I think we flourish when we are exposed to the full spectrum of people's experiences and voices. So diversity and inclusion are pillars, not only of art, but also of science. So I see the symposium as an opportunity to learn from each other. So at the Young Academy, we've focused more and more on diversity and inclusion, not only within the Young Academy, how to improve the diversity of our own members, but also how we can improve diversity in academia at large in the Netherlands. And I just want to tell you about two projects that we've worked on over the past 2 years. So in one project, which was led by Lynette Taylor and Saskia Bonjour, we asked whether and how to collect data on migration backgrounds, race, ethnicity of staff as well as students at Dutch universities, because those data are not collected. So on the one hand, these data are really critical for designing effective diversity policies, but on the other hand, collecting those data also contains important risks, because categorizing people could inadvertently increase the risk of stigmatization and exclusion and discrimination. And our report explores this ethical question. Should we do it? And if so, how can we best do it? Another project that we are working on with a number of people is our first generation project, focused on first generation academics. So scientists who grew up in families whose parents did not complete, who do not hold a university degree. And we know that first-generation scientists are very much underrepresented in academia compared to the general population. So in this study, we wanted to interview a wide range of first-generation scientists in the Netherlands and inquire about their subjective experiences in academia, but also to ask them about the types of barriers that they've faced throughout their careers, also about the unique opportunities that they've had in academia. So now to the speakers. I'm super excited that we have 4 amazing speakers today. André Simpian, who's a professor in psychology at New York University. Tegia Stamku, she's a professor in psychology at the University of Amsterdam. Anthony Heidweiler, a renowned artist and also a member here at the Society of Arts. And Judy Mesman, a professor at Pedagogical Sciences at Leiden University, and also a member at the KNAW. So you've probably seen from the program, we have a very tight schedule. So each talk will be 20 minutes. We have 5 minutes for Q&A after each talk. Anthony is already smiling, so when you ask questions, please stick to the higher level questions. So if you have specific questions about, I don't know, let's say, certain methods people have used in their studies, please ask those questions during the break at 8 p.m. or during the drinks after 9 p.m. Okay, I'm super excited. Thank you so much. So our first speaker will be Andre. And we were just talking during the dinner, like when we first met, but it was probably about 6 years ago. So Andre is a professor at New York University. He specializes in motivation and achievement from childhood onwards, and he has a special focus on inequalities based on gender, but also race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, and it's in particular what types of stereotypes people hold about people who belong to those groups and how those stereotypes might discourage some people or affect people in particular fields in academia, but also in childhood. So the floor is yours, Andre.
Well, thank you, Eddie, for the nice introduction and for bringing us all together here at the beautiful Turpin House. This is my first time, and I'm really enjoying it. And thank you also for coming out on this very, very dreary November night. I appreciate you all being here with us. So I'm excited to share some of the work that my collaborators and I have done on the question of the relationship between beliefs about intellectual ability and the diversity of various fields and organizations. One caveat before I start is that most of the data that I'll tell you about today actually pertains to the US. So I'll actually be curious in the Q&A or during the breaks to get your perspective on how the processes that I'm describing here might apply to the context of the Netherlands or other contexts that you might be familiar with. So the goal of the research that I'll tell you about today is to try to understand why some careers in organizations reflect the diversity of our society and others not so much. And as a test case, we focused on gender differences among academic fields. The fields that are most often talked about in this context are STEM fields, where STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And not surprisingly, when you look at these fields, see here data on engineering and physics PhDs from the US National Science Foundation. You see that they have large gender gaps. So for example, in the US, these are very recent data, only about 20 to 30% of PhDs in these fields are women. What's interesting, though, and less often talked about, is that there's quite a bit of variability among STEM fields in terms of their female representation. So if you look at fields like biology or the geosciences, you see that they have reached parity, at least at the PhD level. Also interesting and potentially revealing for our purposes is that the situation in the humanities and social sciences is in some ways not too different as far as variability in gender representation is concerned from the situation in STEM. So you have fields like philosophy of music theory and composition where the gender gaps rival in magnitude those in STEM fields, and of course other fields as well in this broad domain where women have reached parity or surpassed men in terms of PhD representation. So when we talk about the gender gaps in STEM, we paper over a lot of the variability that's actually important to pay attention to that exists in each of these broad domains. So what we were interested in is understanding this variability and understanding what might there be about a field, even fields as very dissimilar on the surface as philosophy and engineering that might be less than conducive to women's participation. So why might it be that we see women being underrepresented in fields as far-flung as philosophy and physics, music theory and composition? One possibility is suggested by the fact that our society still associates high-level intellectual ability, intellectual firepower, genius, brilliance, however you name it, with men more than women, with boys more than girls. This is an article from the New York Times not so long ago. The author had access to anonymous Google searches performed by American parents in the 21st century about their sons and their daughters, and he was interested in how often parents searched Google about the physical versus the intellectual attributes of their sons and their daughters. And what you see when you look at his results is that for every 10 searches about daughters being intellectually gifted, there are about 25 searches about boys being intellectually gifted. So parents were much more likely to ask Google whether their boys were geniuses than whether their girls were geniuses. And it's important to point out that these are in sort of vertical perceptions. It's more like parents are interacting with their kids and picking up on the fact that the boys are smarter than the girls. If you actually look at gifted and talent programs in the US, for example, you see that girls are actually overrepresented in these programs relative to boys. Sadly, but also perhaps not surprisingly, when you look at physical attributes, parents were more likely to search Google for physical attributes concerning their daughters relative to their sons. So for every 10 searches about girls being overweight, there are about 17 searches about boys being overweight, there are about 17 searches about girls being overweight. Parents even ask Google whether things like, is my daughter ugly? I'm not even sure what exactly you expect Google to tell you if you ask it if your daughter is ugly, but nevertheless, these are searches that parents in the, in the privacy of their homes decide it's a good idea to perform, right? A little bit closer to home and academia, some of you may be familiar with this, and this is potentially a more US-centric kind of website, but there's probably versions of this in the Netherlands as well. Read My Professor is a site where undergraduates, college students can go to and rate their instructors anonymously. An academic went and scraped the open-ended text data from this website, so the undergrads can also write open-ended evaluations of their instructors. And it's now text searchable, so you can go to a website, I'll give you the address on the next slide, and search for any term you want, and I'll give you a breakdown of how often that term appears in reviews of male and female instructors across about 25 fields. Consistent with what I was showing you on the previous slide, when you search for terms like genius and brilliant, you see that those terms appear 2 to 3 times more often in reviews of male instructors relative to female instructors. There's no single field across these 25 where these words were used more often for female instructors than for male instructors. It's important to point out that this is, 14 million reviews, so a lot of data. Again, these are completely anonymous, so you can go in, you don't have to put your name. These are people sort of like providing their unvarnished views of their instructors. And also, this is not, as we report in this paper, it's not an unmitigated bias against women. If you search for other superlatives like amazing or excellent, you actually see that those are pretty evenly distributed in reviews of male and female instructors. So it's not that American undergrads don't think that their female instructors are incompetent. It's just that they think that they're not quite as smart as their male instructors. So what does this have to do with the problem that we started with? So what does this have to do with the variability in the representation of women across various fields? Well, my colleagues and I have proposed that this broad stereotype that associates intellectual ability, brilliance, genius with men more than women combines with differences among academic fields, but other sort of organizations, institutions in our society in terms of the extent to which they believe that high-level intellectual ability, brilliance is required for success in those fields. So the basic idea here is that perhaps biologists, sociologists, mathematicians have systematically different ideas about what it takes to be a successful academic in those fields. And it's particularly in fields whose members believe that you need to be exceptionally intellectually gifted, that given the stereotypes that impugn women's intellectual abilities, you see the biggest gaps in gender representation. After a lot of brainstorming, we call this hypothesis the field-specific ability beliefs hypothesis, in large part because it has the desirable property of having a cute acronym, FAB. It's hard to disagree with the FAB hypothesis. A couple of caveats here. Obviously, the problem of gender gaps in academia and elsewhere is enormously complex, so this is not the only factor that contributes to gender gaps. There are many things that factor into this phenomenon. However, we think that this combination of brilliant stereotypes and beliefs about success and variability in beliefs about success is an important and previously unrecognized factor that contributes to gender gaps. I should also say that when I'm talking about brilliance, I'm referring to it as kind of like an intuitive construct. This is the notion of brilliance that people are operating with on a daily basis, and therefore it's vague. They operate on the basis of, I'll know it when I see it. And that actually makes it as pernicious as it is, because of course, if it's I'll know it when I see it, you tend to see it in some people more than others. The first bit of evidence for this hypothesis comes from a nationwide study of US academics. We surveyed academics across 30 different fields, and we asked them a number of questions, including, most importantly for our purposes, what they believe is required for success in their field. To what extent do they believe that a spark of genius is required for success in their field? And I've put that on the x-axis here. So the higher the numbers, the more of an emphasis on brilliance. The y-axis is the female representation at the PhD level. These are census data from the US National Science Foundation. So what do we see when we looked at this relationship? As predicted by our account, we see that the more members of a field report that success in their field requires brilliance, the fewer women obtain PhDs in that field. So fields over here are fields where both their members report about their own field, that you need a special gift or talent in order to succeed in that field, and confer a small number of PhDs to women. And I also wanted to highlight some of these fields here that are in this most problematic quadrant. We have both clearly science-related fields like mathematics at the basis of a lot of the sciences, and fields like music theory and composition, which again on the surface are very different from fields like mathematics, but seem to share this belief that you need to be brilliant to succeed, and a hefty gender gap. It's important for our account to also look at whether these field-specific ability beliefs explain representation within the broad domain of STEM, not just when you put STEM and non-STEM fields together. And in fact, it does. So if you subset the 30 fields to just the 12 STEM fields, you see a relationship of very similar magnitude. And when you look at just the 18 social science and humanities fields in this sample, you see, again, a relationship of very similar magnitudes. That the more a field emphasizes brilliance, the fewer women obtain PhDs in this field. These data they're interesting, but they have a lot of limitations. We're looking just at PhD completion. We're looking just at US PhDs. In more recent work, I've teamed up with a few computer scientists, and we were able to use data from ORCID, which is an author tracking software some of you may be familiar with. If you publish papers, most journals now require that you have an ORCID account, which enables you to sort of associate your papers with your name and not with all the other like John Smiths out there, right? Or other people who share your name. Oops, fewer gestures. So in these data, people on ORCID, people can fill out their profiles. So you essentially have, for people who fill out their profiles, a CV where they can tell you where they got their bachelor's degree, their PhD, where they got their first job, their second job, and so on and so forth. So what we were interested in doing with these global data is look at academics' transitions across fields and look at whether we can use these field-specific ability beliefs to predict women's and men's movements across fields. Is it the case then women are more likely to move towards fields that are lower in emphasis on brilliance, and conversely, then men move towards fields that are higher in emphasis on brilliance. And let me show you this figure, which I want to show you both because it's interesting, but also because it's the closest thing to art in this presentation. I owe this to my computer science collaborators. So this is a little bit complicated, but I hope the overall takeaway will become very apparent. So I've arranged the fields here in terms of brilliance orientation, with the highest brilliance orientation fields at the top and the lowest ones at the bottom. Each of these arcs is people transitioning across fields. So for example, getting a PhD in mathematics and an assistant professor job in computer science. So each of these arcs is people transitioning from one field to another. The more blue an arc is, the more men are transitioning across fields relative to what you would expect given the composition of the source field. The more red an arc is, the more women are transitioning between those two fields. And the last very important bit here to understand this figure is that we have upstream arcs on the left-hand side of the graph and downstream arcs, downstream the brilliance gradient on the right-hand side. So what you can hopefully see with a naked eye, although we have a lot of regressions as well in this paper, is that the arcs on the right-hand side of the graph are more red, and the arcs on the left-hand side of the graph are more blue, meaning that more men are moving upstream the brilliance gradient, and more women are moving downstream the brilliance gradient. And again, this is a data set of global scholars at career stages from undergrad degree to a professor or department chair. So provides additional generalizability to our account. It's important to note that the account that I've proposed, even though I proposed it in the context of gender, can be used to analyze not just gender gap, but also race gaps. Many minority groups in our society, for example, African Americans in American society, are negatively stereotyped with respect to their intellectual abilities, which means that they too might be underrepresented, particularly in fields where raw innate intellectual talent is valued. And this is, in fact, what we see when we look at the representation of African Americans at the PhD level, and you plot it against this field-specific ability beliefs variable. You see again that the more a field values brilliance, the fewer African Americans obtain PhDs in that field. And importantly, you don't get the same relationship for groups in our society that aren't negatively stigmatized with respect to their abilities. So if you look at, for example, Asian Americans who aren't targeted by the same stereotypes, you don't see a negative relationship like you see for African Americans. An important question that's raised by all this is the question of mechanisms. So how is it that these brilliance beliefs get under the skin and cause the representation of groups such as women and African Americans? And this is a question that we're actively pursuing in my lab right now, so I'm just going to give you a sort of a very cursory summary of some of the things that we're finding. So in a set of experimental studies, we've shown that messages about brilliance undermine young women's interest in a range of professional and educational opportunities, whereas these same messages have no effect on men's interests. So the idea is that because women are growing up in a society that tells them that they're less likely to have high-level intellectual ability than men, they may opt out of fields that are portrayed as requiring exactly this level of intellectual ability. But of course, there's also a gatekeeper bias that's involved here. So in another series of studies, we found that gatekeepers' bias against women is exacerbated in contexts that emphasize intellectual ability, such that, for example, people are less likely to refer or nominate women for jobs that are described as requiring brilliance. Both of these processes pertain to the recruitment stage, so getting people into a field to join a field, but there are similar processes that also work against the diversity of a field at the retention stage. So once you got people in the door, how do you make sure that they thrive in that field as opposed to going elsewhere and looking for other opportunities? So we, in another set of data, we found that field-specific ability beliefs that value brilliance also foster what's known as a masculinity contest culture, an atmosphere within a field, a set of behavioral norms that are extremely competitive and zero-sum, essentially. Your gain is my loss and my gain is your loss. This works against women and many minority groups representation. So the idea here is that if success depends on showing that you're brilliant, then you better not admit that you don't know the answer to a question, right? Because that doesn't look very brilliant. You better not look for other people's advice, because again, that doesn't look very brilliant. You better compete with others in your lab, in your department, in your field, because otherwise, how many people that are brilliant can there be in one lab, one department, one field, right? So this sort of atmosphere where zero-sum competition is very common, and displaying uncertainty is discouraged, is both particularly common in fields that, or at least we hypothesize, in fields that value brilliance, and may be detrimental to women's participation. So here are results from a study on about 1,400 academics across a range of fields, where we measured both to what extent they perceive their field to value brilliance and to what extent they perceive their field to exhibit this kind of masculinity contest culture, this kind of dog-eat-dog, zero-sum set of behavioral norms. What we see is overall, both women and men, the more they perceive their field to value brilliance, the more they perceive this kind of culture. But this relationship is particularly strong for women. And in part, we didn't expect this going into it, but in retrospect, it makes sense because women being less familiar with these sorts of cultures and less comfortable with them because of the way they're socialized might actually be more sensitive to their presence, hence the steeper slope here. Another mechanism that works against retaining a diverse workforce has to do with making capable scholars of color and female scholars doubt that they've earned the success that they've had up to the point. So to the extent that fields that value brilliance make women and capable scholars of color feel that their success is unearned, they've made it as far as they have through some stroke of luck, but any day now they're going to be uncovered for being frauds, which is what's known as the imposter phenomenon. You may have heard of this. It's kind of made the rounds in popular culture as well. That might also work against the diversity of fields that are oriented toward brilliance. So the idea here being that the more a field values brilliance, the more women and scholars of color might feel this way, might feel like imposters, and that's not a very sort of pleasant state to be in the long term, and therefore you might go elsewhere. I'm going to tell you about a study on about 4,600 academics, spearheaded by my former student, Melis Muradoglu. We surveyed them again with respect to the extent to which they perceive their field to emphasize brilliance, as well as the extent to which they report feeling like an imposter, feeling like their colleagues and their peers and their students are going to discover how much ability they lack. And we separated the participants in the study into white and Asian participants. Neither of these groups is underrepresented in academia relative to their share of the population. And underrepresented minority, which in the US context is mostly African American and Latina academics. So what you see is generally, the more academics perceive their field to value brilliance, the more they feel like imposters. But this relationship is particularly strong for women of color. So for women of color in academia, the more they perceive their field to value brilliance, especially the more they feel like imposters. They feel like frauds. They feel like their successes is unearned. There's an interesting but not significant negative slope for men of color, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. We don't really have good ideas, but maybe you'll have some. But the takeaway here is that generally the relationship is positive and is particularly strong for women of color, again, working against retaining a diverse workforce in brilliance-oriented fields. Just a little bit of data on development. As Eddie mentioned, I'm a developmental psychologist, and I like to think about the developmental history of the processes that I've told you about among adults. I focused on adult data because of the topic of the symposium, but it's important to understand that these processes do have a developmental history, and it's important, especially if you're trying to intervene to change the way things are, to understand when some of these noxious beliefs develop so that potentially you can intervene earlier, rather than waiting until people have had these beliefs in their heads for 10, 15 years, when it might be hard to change their minds about some of these things. So the first question we ask here is, when does the stereotype develop that associates brilliance with men more than women? It's hard to ask kids questions about gender. Well, it's hard to ask kids anything because their language is less developed than yours, and also they have different motivations than you might have. So in the age group that we're talking with here, so 5 to 7-year-olds, when a lot of gender stereotypes about intellectually relevant things develop, there's a lot of in-group bias. So girls report that girls are better than boys at everything, no matter what you ask them about, and the same for boys, right? So it's kind of like the age of, in English, they call them cooties. There may be an analogous word in Dutch as well, like where the other gender is just like untouchable and they're worse than your gender no matter what the dimension. So we had to ask about gender without really asking about gender. So how do we do that? We tell kids stories like this. So we say things like, there are lots of people at the place where I work, but there's one person who's really, really special. This person's really, really smart. This person can figure things out quickly and comes up with answers much faster and better than anyone else. This person's really, really smart, right? So you can tell I spend a lot of time with 4-year-olds. So a couple of important things here. One is that we didn't say brilliant or genius because these are 5-year-olds, so they're not going to know what we're talking about. The other thing is, and this is even more important, we're not mentioning the gender of this person. So we're talking about this person this and this person that, but we're not saying he, she, we're not giving any clues to the person's gender, letting them kids figure out on their own, and then kind of catching them in the act of making a guess by showing them a bunch of unfamiliar men and women and saying, if you had to make a guess, who do you think the person in this story is? Kids are more than willing to make a guess. Adults might think that's a weird question, but kids not so much. So we tally how often they pick women if they're girls and men if they're boys. So how often they pick people of their own gender as being the really, really smart person in the story. And what we find is that At the age of 5, generally kids pick members of their own gender as being really, really smart. So the in-group bias that I was telling you about is still alive and strong. However, at the age of 6, we find something quite different, where already girls are less likely to pick members of their own gender as being really, really smart, and that continues at 7. So at least one way of interpreting these data is that at the age of 6, and we can think more about why the age of 6 is the age at which a lot of these stereotypes that associate brilliance with men more than women have their developmental origins. Last thing I want to say is, what can we do? So there's a lot of evidence here. What can we do on the basis of this? Evidence? In principle, you can intervene on either of the two big beliefs at the core of this model. So you can intervene on the stereotypes that associate men with brilliance more than women, or you can intervene on the definitions of success that different organizations or fields use. My argument is that it's a bit of a losing battle to try to intervene on stereotypes. Many people have tried, but it's really, really hard. You might tell kids whatever you want to tell them in the context of your classroom, in the context of your home, but once they leave your home or your classroom, they're going to be bombarded with messages that contradict whatever you want to tell them about associations with women and men. So I think it's more productive, at least in the short term, for us to try to intervene on definitions of success, like how kids think about what's required for success in a field. In particular, to the extent that we can change the messages that are sent about success to emphasize the extent to which you can grow, the extent to which being passionate and putting in the hard work can actually help grow your skills in that particular field, and the extent to which we can de-emphasize traits like brilliance and genius, that will help make fields that are currently unwelcoming to more than half of the population, welcoming to people who haven't been traditionally welcome in these fields. So thank you for your attention. You can download papers here, and thank you to my funders, and looking forward to questions.
I want to introduce Gia. She is an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and she is the only person that I know that studies the psychological impact of art. And she does it from a psychological perspective, but also a developmental psychological perspective. So she also studies, for instance, how kids respond to art. She has recently published a paper showing that exposing kids to like Disney clips that elicit awe can make children more pro-social and open them up to the needs of others. And she does amazing work also on gender representation in art and how art influences people's own gender biases.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's very exciting to talk about two projects that are very preliminary, I have to say, so that's a disclaimer. I'm not going to show a lot of results. I'm going to show very little results, but I'm basically presenting our ideas for these projects. And what we are doing in these two projects, one is with paintings, visual artworks, the other one is with movies. We are trying to measure diversity and stereotypes, and then we are trying to see to what extent diversity and stereotypes in art have any effect really on gender inequality in the real world. So how do we do that? Because artworks there is great variability, right? Let's say every artwork is unique, so how do you study that? So let's see how we tried to approach this question. I like to start with this painting because I'm a big fan of Frida Kahlo, and Frida Kahlo was a very powerful woman. But here Frida is painting herself next to her partner, Diego Rivera, both of them being painters, and herself having painted this, then she gives the palette to Diego, right? Diego is the one who is holding the palette here. So what is the place of women in the arts? And I'd like to start with some statistics from the Netherlands. So this is one of our partners. We collaborate with Women Inc. in this project, which is an organization that is active, takes a lot of political action to improve the place of women across sectors in the Netherlands. And they did here a small exploratory study with Dutch museums. And they found in their statistics that about 70% of students in art academies in the Netherlands are women. But 38% of active visual artists in the Netherlands are women. And then if you look at the 8 major museums of the Netherlands, it's only 13% of the exhibited artworks that are made by women. So what happens on the way, right? How can we start from 70% and end up with 13% on what we see on the walls? That's quite intriguing. So what we wanted to see is what is the representation of female artists across time and space. So we wanted to scale that up and study that historically over a long period of time, but also cross-culturally to see how that has changed over time and over space. Then we wanted to look into the canvas to see how female characters are portrayed in these artworks, right? Are they portrayed in stereotyped ways, for instance? And then the final question is, do stereotyped depictions, do these stereotyped portrayals of female characters relate somehow to gender inequality in the real world? So what Andrei was just mentioning, when do you see all these cultural products portraying women in a certain way, does that have anything to do with what kind of expectations and behaviors we have in real life? I'm not going to talk at all about the third part of this project. We're using census data. I'm going to talk about the first 2 parts. So just a mini introduction on social role theory. The idea here being that men and women have different social roles because there are different activities that we expect them to perform. So we want women to be, they have more affiliative roles, right? We expect them to be more involved with childcare and taking care in general of people, whereas men have more agentic roles. We expect them to be more involved in money-oriented fields, and also, as Andrei was saying again, this idea of, let's say, more analytical thinking and using their brains and maths. So there are strong stereotypes that we expect women to engage in more communal roles and in men in more agentic roles. And to perform these social roles successfully, we also have expectations about their emotional expressions, right? So if childcare is the main thing that you're doing, then we expect women to show more affiliative emotions like smiling and happiness. And for somebody who shows more agentic, has more agentic roles, then other kind of emotions, more dominant emotional expressions are expected, such as anger expressions, for instance. So it is indeed like stereotypes and how those are reflected on the emotional expressions of people. Here you see a meta-analysis where the vast majority of studies, about 350 studies, found that indeed women smile more than men, and only about 65 studies found that men smile more than women. So that seems to be pretty robust. And even in young children, here's another meta-analysis with young children. What this study showed is that young boys are more likely to show anger expressions, and young girls are more likely to show things like fear and anxiety, fear and shame and sympathy, so more affiliative emotions, submissive emotions, plus a general positive affect, which we don't see in that graph. Okay, so Now, how did we go about studying this in artworks? So the first thing that we did is that we developed a crawler, like a scraper basically, which goes to Google Arts and Culture. Google Arts and Culture here is another partner of our project. And it goes to the website, it goes to the painter, Raphael in this case, then it searches Raphael on Wikipedia, gets information about Raphael on Wikipedia, specifically their date of birth, their nationality, and their gender expression here. And then it goes back to Google Arts and Culture on the reel of their paintings, and it starts scraping one by one the artworks. So it makes a screenshot of each artwork, saves that, it goes to the next painter. So for instance, this would look something like that. So making a screenshot of Raphael's work. So by doing this, we have almost now collected about 2 million paintings that we want to analyze. So how do you analyze 2 million paintings that span, as I said, like this long period of time and a cultural span? We're doing two things with the paintings, or I'm going to talk about the two things that we're doing. One is that we're using an object detection model. Here we are detecting humans, and then the same model is used to do two kinds of attributions, two kinds of assignments. One is the gender expression, and we're using a model that does a categorization into predominantly feminine, predominantly masculine, or unknown gender expression. And then the second classification it does is the age range. So here it is young, middle, and old. These are the three categories. And what we do with that is that we take the center of these boxes and we estimate the distance between the middle-aged feminine character to the young age characters in the artwork. So we're basically estimating physical proximity of male and female characters from young children who need care. So as a way of approximating a proxy for child caring. So this is quite explicit, you would say, as an index, but then we also look at emotions. So here we use another model that is powered by Hume AI. Hume AI is a technology company that we're also working with, and they have a gender expression model that is trained on photographs of people, and now we also want to train this on images of paintings. And what this model does is that it detects human faces, and then it projects the emotion expression of the human face onto a conceptual space of emotions. So here you can see it detected two faces, P1, P2, person 1, person 2, and it considers the expression of the of P1, person 1, as mostly sad. So this is here you can see the space, right? Like here, here's, let's say, the emotional space of person 1 around the negative emotions, and the ones that score the highest are sadness, disappointment, tiredness. But you get a full spectrum of the emotions that are being detected on the face. And for person 2 is calmness, tiredness, boredom, so low valence emotions. So we basically do this with all paintings, and here I can show you some more examples of how that performs. This is Medusa, so some very strong negative emotions. And this is Jenny Seville, and again, like pain, distress. So it performs pretty decently, even if we haven't trained it yet on paintings. And this is our idea of capturing stereotyped expressions, so in terms of emotions and child caring. And for the third prong of that project, we aim to study these on a historical basis with specific kind of analysis that can tell us which one may drive what. Is it, let's say, gender inequality in the real world that makes artists portray female characters in a certain way, or the other way around? So this is the painting project, and I would now like to talk about our movie project, where similar questions are being asked. So here you can see a scene from a movie that I love, Tar, a very counter-stereotypical movie in many ways. So what do we do in this project? Again, we look at diversity and stereotypes. We look at the diversity behind the scenes. So we look at the creative team, the director, the writer, the cinematographer, the producer. So we look at what happens behind the scenes, how much diversity is there. We also look at the diversity on the screen, how much diversity, gender diversity, is on the screen. And then we also look at stereotypes. So what we do in part of the project is that we align script files with subtitle files to end up with something like that on the right-hand side, where we basically assign a gender to the different verses, and also we measure the time that they speak, the different characters in the movie. So by doing that, we can also do a network analysis of the movie. So here you can see the movie Don't Look Up, where the most central character was Leonardo DiCaprio, and then there are also pretty big nodes for Jennifer Lawrence and Meryl Streep and Kate Blanchett. So why we do that? We use network analysis because we want to see not only the absolute representation of female characters in the movie, but also how central they are. So here you can see what it looks like on a small sample of movies that we analyzed from the movies that we have. So what these three graphs mean, just so to give you, let's say, an anchor to understand this, is that if it was 0.5, it's equal. So there is an equal representation of female and male characters in terms of speaking time. So female characters and male characters would speak the same if this round part of the graph would be in the center. So the fact that it's towards the lower end of the graph, the bottom part of the graph, it means that male characters get to speak longer than female characters. The same happens with cast ratio. So if we were to count all the people who got credits in the movie because they had a speaking role, it would be, again, like men having a greater representation in the cast. And with centrality, it looks slightly better, but still, like you can see that male characters had more central roles than female characters. Is that getting any better over time? Well, it does. As you can see, movies that were released in the 1940s, and if you compare with movies that were released in 2010, it is getting upwards, but still it's far from the middle point of the scale, right? The 0.5. So there is a long way to go, basically. What I can tell you already, like some of the results that we have, so we have individual level movie ratings. So we have about 50,000 movies that are rated by different users of a platform that we use. We collaborate with MovieLens on this project, where it's a recommender system where people can rate movies and get recommendations. And what we find is that the greater representation of female characters in the cast, for instance, the lower the movie rating. So we're now looking more into that, and we're also trying to understand, okay, there is underrepresentation, there is less representation of women in the movies, but where is this coming from? Like, if you have a more diverse creative team behind the scenes, would that improve the things a little bit? So these are some of the questions we're asking here, and another question we're asking is the influence of cultural factors. So we're trying to understand also whether personal taste for art, for movies in this case, is influenced by higher order cultural values. So whether, let's say, it matters whether you live in a state in the US, this is all US data, is, let's say, more liberal or more conservative. I'd like to thank the various partners on these two projects, so Women Inc., Google Arts and Culture, and Hume AI for the painting project, and Movie Lens for the movie project, and then all my wonderful collaborators on both projects.
Our next speaker will be Anthony Heidweiler, and he's a renowned figure in the arts, and he has a lot of experiences dealing with diversity and inclusion in his own work. He has been the artistic director of the Yo Opera Festival and Vocal Statements. And in these roles, he has a lot of experience in diverse audience engagement and bridging the gap between the performing arts and the multicultural society. Thank you, Anthony. Very much looking forward to your talk.
Good evening, everybody. I don't have slides, so you have to watch me. So I'm sorry. I'm going to share a secret with you. I am the deputy director of the art school here, the Academie of Theater en Dans. And I'm developing my vision for the coming years. My school doesn't know anything yet. So please, we keep it here. All right. Culture is bad for you. This is the title of a book published in 2020, subtitled Inequality in the Culture and Creative Industries. It's a book published by the University of Manchester. The main conclusion from this book is that of all the different professions that exist, education, transport, hospitality, healthcare, etc., the arts are by far the most conservative. I can also illustrate this very simple because we all know the following little conversation. Yesterday I saw such a wonderful performance, beautiful text, brilliant design. I can really recommend it. And oh yes, so great. The lead actor was black. But do we ever say, I had such a wonderful bus journey, and oh yes, so nice, the bus driver was black. Thank you, Young Academy, for inviting me to speak here today on the subject of diversity and inclusion in art and science. This starts with the confrontation for me that the art have to reconsider their care function their core function or core position in the world. The title of my talk is Opportunistic in Inclusion Policy, or Opportunistic Diversity and Inclusion Policy. On the 7th of October 2022, I gave a speech at the celebration of the 50th anniversary of a theater in Utrecht. The host announced me with the words, "The director of the Academy for Theater and Dance." I walked to the front and began my celebration speech with words that I did not have on paper and that came out of my mouth completely unexpectedly. If the murder on 25th of May 2020 had not happened, I would not be the director of the Academy of Theatre and Dance now. I remained silent for a moment and then I began my prepared speech. Like many people with a colonial or migrant background who have worked very hard over the past decades to gain a responsible position in Dutch society, I too had suddenly been approached for a top position. I gradually realized that I too had allowed myself to be dragged into that policy on racism and discrimination that is mainly characterized by not talking about it. That cosmetic policy that only focuses on positive results, policies based on opportunism. First, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word. These are words of the French Martinique poet, playwright Aimé Césaire, who died in 2008. Because what is it really about? Do we want more people with a colonial and migratory back past in our sector, art and science, or is it instead about critically and independently shining our light on the Dutch bloody and cruel history? And that through this confrontation we create a deeper awareness of the role of the European in history? In recent years, the concept of diversity and inclusive policies has rapidly become a buzzword. The term is widely embraced by artists, scholars, programmers, and art and educational institutions. The fast pace of which these concepts have been embraced also means that they risk getting bogged down in good intentions or moral laziness, and they risk being stripped of any concrete political meaning. Taking stock, I think much has changed for the better. We are, especially after the 25th of May 2020, in a phase of a transition. What I personally do find very painful in the conversations I have, the performance I sometimes see, and the policy documents I read, is that I have to conclude that there is a lack of good and reliable historical basic background knowledge. This is one of the reasons why we started the book club. Trees that grow slowly get deep roots, in September 2020 at the Academy of Arts. Scholars and artists read books by black and brown writers and authors. It enriches us and provides depth. And we also started this year a book club here at the KNAW. The other day I was walking through the Leidseplein with my young boys on my way to see the show Neighbor, Neighbor, Buurman, Buurman. Suddenly, the youngest called out, pointing at the Stad Schouwburg, "Look, that's where the king lives." The theater as a palace, the art as religion. It was only 200 years ago that God and the king were declared dead and the and artists and scientists took over their roles. They built their own palaces and churches, the theaters and the opera houses, the academies and the museums. With the onset of the Enlightenment, art developed from a culture of experience to a culture of performance. In the new palaces and churches came stages, and people had to be quiet. In a museum, people moved silently from one object to another. The stage became one of the most unsafe places where you are judged, watched on, and, where necessary, can be rocked hardly, rejected every time. In his boek middenin, theater en kritiek in een belevingscultuur, Frank Mineur concludes that the arts are now moving, transforming again from a performance culture to an experience culture. Dutch sociologist Hans Boutelier described in his latest book, Het Nieuwe Westen, how Eurocentrism has led to a socio-economic, climate and cultural crisis. Het Nieuwe Westen must come to terms with its violent past by opting for reciprocity and animism. For my clarity, I will let that past begin in the first half of the 17th century with philosopher René Descartes. It was he who at some point pointed the European man as the master and possessor of nature. Man can and may control nature because he is also its possessor or owner. Thus, the European went all over the world and appropriated everything with great display of superiority. This is how European values were formed. Capitalism and meritocracy. In short, economic thinking. Art was experienced, made and designed as a business model. Centuries later, this superiority is highly visible in the art world. Today, there are countless students at art schools and everywhere else, for that matter, from all corners of the world, who see studying in Europe as a status enhancement. Young artists who changed their original name to a European name to make a career that way. This is even done by artists who do not study in Europe, but see themselves in that way as full-fledged only when their work can be seen and or watched in a European or North American museum or theater. Diversity and inclusion in art and science. Taking a step back in time, let's leave Europe and look at the cultures of other continents. Continents which, by the way, incidentally and without exception, all owe their naming to the European. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss described in his book, The Gift from 1929, that most of the world outside Europe had concepts such as reciprocity and animism as their starting point. A stone, a tree, a bird have a soul. They represent our ancestors. Shaman Devi Kopenawa passionately described this culture in his beautiful book, The Falling Sky. The power of art to shape new imaginations has been exhausted, but if we do not delve into history, it risks falling into autobiographical narratives. The power of art, even in the context of diversity and inclusion, is to show us that things do not have to be as the way they always are, but that they can be different. How can we interpret what we experience in new ways? I don't see anything else that has such power. So let's mobilize artists in a unique movement with thinkers from different disciplines, so that we are in an active part of our society. As I said earlier, we are moving from a performance culture to an experience culture. In addition, there is another development going on, not only in the art sector, namely that we are increasingly questioning the ecological footprint of the arts. We are moving, in the words of journalist Rob Wijnberg, from an economic thinking to an ecological thinking. What is our relationship with the earth? April 2020. Ramsi Nasser is on television program Buitenhof, where people are currently discussing the issues surrounding the pandemic. At one point, Nasser asks, why aren't we, artists, not at that consultation table? Why aren't they making use of our knowledge? I think that is because artists have separated themselves from society. Over the past 200 years, moving from being a participant to becoming a spectator. Not standing in the middle of society, but looking at it from the sidelines, the observer. And so when a pandemic breaks out, we are not on the list of vital professions. It's painful. There was a revival from the art world in the middle of the pandemic. That gave me hope. But by now we are back to business as usual, and the artist is still on the list of non-vital professions. Our ecological system is on the verge of collapse, and social economic inequality is increasing worldwide. From my position at the Academy of Theatre and Dance, I noticed that within various national and international structures, people are looking for new ways in which art education can cause a future generation of artists so actively contribute to building bridges in communities, to contribute to social cohesion through the use of art and design, to promote a society that helps restore the environment, to applying new techniques to make our world more livable, that we develop art and design that provides a free space for people to contemplate, to enjoy, to wonder, that helps society to reinvent itself. When you look at the world through regenerative glasses, the distinction between humans and nature falls away. It helps us to see ourselves again as one of the many parts of the web of life, instead of wanting to be high at the top of the pyramid as humans. We cannot close our eyes to this reality, and will have to use energy, raw materials and food differently. Yet we continue to believe in a system that is incredibly far from real progress. Delving deeper into the centuries-old indigenous economy can give us insight into returning or taking the next step towards the original meaning of a sustainable living, namely being kind to each other, caring for each other, and having respect for all life. In the regenerative vision, there is room for the age-old traditions of indigenous people. The same indigenous peoples who were oppressed, exploited, and rejected by colonialists for centuries as savages under the banner of civilization. The transition demands precisely now that we look and listen to their rich traditions and rituals in which the relationship between humans and nature is central. Studying history is crucial, giving the roots a chance to go deep into the earth to ensure a sustainable future. So, regeneration is also a process of necessary introspection, learning to listen to voices that have long been suppressed. This shared mission, inventing new quality standards and ground rules, is the next step in diversity and inclusion policy, is my firm belief. By 2050, a diverse and inclusive Netherlands wants to be fully circular. In a circular ecology, we handle raw materials and products economically and smartly. A circular ecology requires ambition, clear rules, circular entrepreneurship, and a shift in thinking and doing. Now, what does that mean for art education? How can we make our art education circular? How do we translate the ambitions and for the Netherlands in particular, and our Earth in general, to our educational institution? And how do we ensure that there is a generation in time with all the competences needed for a circular society from now on? And what are the basic raw materials in art and art education? How can we draw inspiration from other than European art traditions as well, traditions that may offer us new windows on solutions? Our aim is that within art education we really start to understand why circular education matters and what we can do in it, so that we can appropriately shape our aspiration to educate students who are integral parts of society after their studies. And art students will be better attuned to the roles that will be required of them in the future, such as explorer, guide, advisor, programmer, connector, to contribute to the development of our society with creativity, artistry, and innovation, a contribution based on knowledge of demand and need. Circular art education. It seems like a complex concept, but at its core it is simple. The starting point is a sustainable future for us all. We take students through the importance of circular economy and how that is also in the interest of the student and future artist. Indeed, what the student and future artist and art teacher can do for the circular economy. A simple example of this importance is the energy transition that we are also eagerly awaiting, threatens to stall because too few experts have been trained in that field. Artists must embark on the path of circular thinking now so as not to miss the boat later. Regenerative art education starts with the question, what does the world need? And what do art students need to contribute to it? Teachers and art students should think together about alternative systems that do not cause harm but restore the earth. Is the focus of art education currently mainly on what can you do, what do you know and what do you want to become, and less on how you do it and with whom? Actually, you could say that the arts have fallen into a Eurocentric trap. the building in which in which we teach art, the theaters, museums, concert hall in which we move. I am convinced that we will succeed in extricating ourselves from this trap. To do so, however, we need to embrace something that is not exactly typically Eurocentric. We need to take time and we need to find peace. Trees that grow slowly get deep roots. We need to look back to a time long before Descartes, and from there to the future, because there is no future without a past. Time and rest. It doesn't relate very well to the government's vision that we can take off that whole uncomfortable legacy of 100 years within one reign, achieve inclusive education and an inclusive arts palette within one reign. There is, in the thousands of languages spoken in Africa, no old African word for art. What you hear is Nikisi. Nikisi means something like spirit, or the house of the spirit. Is culture bad for you? The House of Spirit is an inspiring venue for a diverse and inclusive world art focused on reciprocity, tolerance, and animism. This was my contribution, my thoughts.
Very hard to give words to this. Thank you so much. So our next speaker will be Judy Messman. And Judy is a professor in pedagogical sciences at Leiden University. And not only does she research inequality and prejudice in families and education, she also has contributed a lot to gender equality and anti-racist parenting in the Netherlands by publishing her book, Opgroeien in Kleur, but also by being part of the Athena's Angels and fighting very hard for equal opportunities for women in Dutch academia. And I just want to say, I know we're short on time, don't feel pressured. We will just continue a little bit longer than we had planned to.
I will not sing then. Right. So listening to the speakers before me, wonderful. I could have talked about all sorts of things. I could have talked about my work on the role of parents in STEM interest in boys and girls, as also referred to by the first speaker, or the work on gender representation in school textbooks and stereotyping in school textbooks, similar to the work of the second speaker, or my research on the experiences of people of color in leadership positions that Anthony is very familiar with. I'm not going to talk about any of those things. So I'll be, this is something I made up, that's the thing. They ask you for a title weeks in advance, sometimes months in advance. I don't know what I'm going to talk about that long in advance. So I sort of have to make fit what I want to talk about with the title I once, sent in. I'm going to try and do that. So who's asking what? Asking questions is what academics do. It's what researchers do. It's what we sort of do in the classroom. It's what we try to get our students to do. And the real question, I think, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in academia is who's asking what questions? And what does that say about the norms in our academic lives? I'd like to quote Doris Lessing first, one of my heroines. She said, ideally, what should be said to every child repeatedly throughout their school life is something like this. You are in the process of being indoctrinated. We have not yet evolved a system of education that is not a system of indoctrination. We are sorry, but it is the best we can do. She goes on to write, what you are being taught here is an amalgam of current prejudice and the choices of this particular culture. The slightest look at history will show you how impermanent these must be. You are being taught by people who have been able to accommodate themselves to a regime of thought laid down by their predecessors. It is a self-perpetuating system. I could stop speaking now almost, right? This sort of says it all. I think this is a very great, it's a very good quote. It's old, it's from the 1960s, but it shows us, I think, a way of looking at what we're doing in academia and teaching and research that we should probably remind ourselves of pretty much daily, which is something that she also advocates for, to remind ourselves of this daily in the rest of the text. So the boundary between education and indoctrination is a tricky one. Actually, indoctrination means education if you go back to its original Latin root. So it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder whether education is indoctrination or just a way of socializing people and teaching them stuff. One of the distinctions that is being made in the literature about this is the extent to which the learner gets an opportunity to critically examine whatever they're learning. Is their horizon broadened by the teaching that they receive, or is it made more narrow? So the critical examination of the learning materials is one of the criteria by which you can sort of see whether we're talking about indoctrination or socialization or teaching. Now that requires, as far as I'm concerned, transparency. Because if you're talking to students, or if you're talking in your research papers about particular topics and introducing them in certain ways and making certain choices, the question is, why these choices? Who's asking these questions and why? Why are we studying these particular things that I am now laying before you in my lectures? But that transparency is almost always absent. What is transparent is the syllabus. These are the books, this is what you need to read, these are the theories we're going to talk about, and all the stuff that's not talked about. You can't talk about everything, but people are not generally very transparent about why they make the choices they made in terms of what they teach and what they study. And one of the relevant concepts there is the hidden curriculum, which I'm sure you might have heard of, is what educators teach students without even realizing it. It's through their choices that they make, their interaction, their modeling, the unspoken values, beliefs, norms, and culture of a particular institution, of a course, of an entire program. And often teachers aren't aware of doing these things, right? They have been taught in a certain way, following Doris Lessing, so they know these are the books that we're supposed to use, these are the theories I'm supposed to teach. And without even thinking about it, they are portraying a norm, an idea about the world and about science and about their particular field to their students. What is not done is addressing these questions. I'm sure there's courses out there that do this, by the way, but I would say that generally in academia, especially in my field, the behavioral sciences, this is not done. The questions that I think we should be asking ourselves is what knowledge is, or not, valued, produced, taught in academia, and who is or is not represented in academic texts, in academic positions, and in the student body. For some of these questions, I can give one example from my own field. So this is the Handbook of Attachment. It is the Bible of attachment research in a particular field of child and family studies. It's used in many programs that teach about parenting and family life, in many educational programs. This is the third edition from 2016. So it's got, 43 chapters. It's got 80 authors in total, and those 80 authors are from just 7 countries, right? Now, attachment, it's about parents, it's about children, universally interesting, I would say, right? These are the countries that the seven countries that the 80 authors originate from. Well, you can see that they're almost entirely Northern Europe, North America, and there's Israel and there's Australia. And 80% of authors were from the USA. So this is showing how, and I know that there are researchers in Latin America, there are researchers in Africa, there's researchers in Asia that do this work. I know these people. They are not represented in the handbook. They're not asked to write a chapter, and I know why, and this is something that I've been complicit in and I will never do again. It's because there is a chapter on culture. It's the Culture Corner. Because 42 chapters are on, I don't know, neutral, objective, nothing to do with culture topics on parents and children. And then we have one chapter that does culture. And in that chapter, and I wrote it with 2 colleagues, we discuss attachment issues that basically have been studied in 80% of the world, right? Because that is the global south, that houses, that's why it's called the majority world. Also, it's 80% of people in the world are represented in that one single chapter, and not even written by somebody from one of those areas. I would never do this again. I always think it's best to start criticizing yourself before you start criticizing others. I should have asked, when I was requested to write this chapter, who's represented as authors in this textbook? Why is there one chapter about culture? Why aren't people from these regions that I'm supposed to write about writing these chapters? Why isn't culture represented in every chapter? Because how can you pretend that whatever you're writing about, whatever aspect of attachment, is in some way universal or neutral and has nothing to do with culture? Those are the questions I should have asked, and I should have refused to contribute to a book that did it the way it actually ended up doing it. So I learned from that, won't do it again. But this is usually what it looks like, right? The norm is clear. There is a white Western norm. This is the regular, normal stuff you should be learning. If you're interested in culture, we'll do that over there. If you're not, skip the chapter, it's fine. So this is an example that shows us what knowledge is valued, produced and taught or written about in academic texts. It tells us a little bit about who is represented or not represented in academic positions, right? Because these authors in some way, reflect what academia looks like in the Western world. It doesn't say anything about the student body, only indirectly. Eddie touched upon this earlier. The representation in academic positions and the student body, we don't know. In the Netherlands, we don't know. Because we don't keep the numbers, because we don't register it. And I know there's a lot of issues with registration of ethnicity and race, and how it could be misused. On the other hand, not knowing at all, we simply don't know how we're doing. We simply don't know if certain people will make it through the ranks quicker than others. We know for women, there's a lot of research on women, there's a lot of statistics on women and men. We do not know this about ethnic racial minorities, for example, or LGBTQ plus individuals, for that matter. So the people who are there, because all I can do is just look around me, have a bit of a, I've been in academia for long enough, I go to many universities, so I can sort of have a look around. And then, as soon as you get to the professor level and all the professor dinners, there's not a lot of brown and black people over there, I can tell you, right? So just simply anecdotally, the statistic looks bad. The ones that are there usually did not make it by questioning dominant norms. The ones that made it there also conform. Doris Lessing made it there because they conformed to the mainstream, because they were unthreatening, because they, produced work and did it in a way that was similar to what was done already, which made them, acceptable in the mainstream community. This has not really been studied a lot. This is my anecdotal experience of what I see around me. What we're looking for, I think, in academia is more of counterculture, you might say, right? Those questioning dominant norms. We have it. We have students, you read about it. There are students in particular and some staff that really protest against some of the mainstream ways of doing science, the mainstream ways of rewarding people in academia in ways that are maybe not that great in terms of diversity and inclusion. And then what happens is it gets translated into policies. When it gets difficult, it's ignored. When they feel like you can translate it into a number, a policy, a slogan, they will do it. This is something that Anthony, I think, was also referring to. And what happens, and this is an interesting book to read, it is captured, it is co-opted. This is a book called Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else, which basically describes how potentially good ideas from countercultural movements, when it gets loud enough, the elite, the leaders will feel like they have to do something with it, and they will do something with it, but something that fits in the mainstream narrative and in the dominant culture, right? And then you get the diversity policies that we all know, you get the anti-bias training, you get a few nice statistics, and that's roughly it. It gets co-opted, it gets neutralized, it becomes dangerous, right? It loses its power to really make changes. And then it becomes really difficult to stay motivated, to, through all that, lingo, stay motivated to look at deeper ways of addressing some of the representation and lack of inclusion issues in academia. Because what that would require, in my view, is to constantly ask these questions the whole time. Why are we doing what we're doing? Who are we doing it with? When are we doing it? Where are we doing it? How are we doing it? All the questions, the fundamental questioning of your organization, of the context of your program, is the only way to get to the bottom of figuring out, why are these people in this room? Why are some people not in this room? And to not simply say they're not here, let's have some targets. No, why? Why are they not here? What are we doing that they're not here? Why are certain questions not asked? Why are certain publications never valued? Why is that really, right? And what does that mean for how we should be looking at our field? And out of all of these, I guess the why is the most important. Wait, but why? Why? Again, tell me? Because a lot of these things are seen as the natural order of things. Whenever you do something that is part of the dominant discourse, you don't have to question it. You don't have to justify it, because that is how it's always gone. It's only when you try to find an alternative that everybody asks you why. We should be asking why about what is normal far more often than we should be asking why of the stuff that is considered different and new and more controversial. This is really annoying, obviously, right? If you start asking why, we will be looking like 2-year-olds all day if we ask why every time we encounter anything. It could be kind of fun in a way. I recently, just today actually, sent in the title and abstract for another talk I'm going to do literally in September 2024. There's no way I'm going to talk about what I said I'm going to talk about. But anyway, I ended up using the title, Who's Afraid of Diversity and Inclusion? And the first sentence of the abstract was, spoiler alert, everybody. And I mean everybody, because if you really do it well and do this, the fundamental questioning of what you're doing with whom and why, etc., that ain't fun. Everybody's afraid of that. That eats at the very fabric of whatever you thought was true and whatever you've been learning and doing and working at. And that could be quite threatening to people, right? Your whole professional identity, your personal identity could be questioned in a new number of ways. That's kind of scary. I think it's worth doing. It could also be fun. I think we should not be so scared and maybe not so, afraid of changing course or reevaluating what we're doing and why. I think that would actually be reflective of what academia is supposed to be like, is to not only follow in the footsteps of the dominant mainstream, but the whole idea is to question. It's good to be critical of your own work. It's fine if you don't like 50% of the stuff you've published in the past 20 years, right? Because it means that you're growing and not just doing the same thing. But that is a difficult thing to do when you've won all your awards based on this particular theory, right? When everybody knows you because of this particular work. So the incentive to start questioning that and say, I might have been wrong. Not so sure, Looking at the stuff that I've been reading now and some of my new insights, I think I'm going to have to, take a whole different route. People don't do that. There's too much at stake. There's money, there's positions, there's status, and then all the PhD students and all the students and all the programs, right? And I think those type of institutional mechanisms are the ones we're going to have to look for to open up that door so that the wait but why question isn't so threatening, but actually interesting and possibly rewarding and fun. That's what I would want to go for. Thank you.
So we are about to go to the drinks, but I just wanted to say thank you to Judy. And also just to briefly reflect on the title you just submitted, so Who's Afraid of Diversity and Inclusion? I think I agree, we all are. But I hope this symposium made you a little bit less afraid. And I hope this symposium can also serve as a conversation starter, that we can have more of these symposia in the future and we can continue to talk and think about this more deeply as we think about ways to make academia and the arts more diverse and inclusive. So thanks everyone for showing up at such an inconvenient time, and hope to see you at the drinks.